Good morning, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you this morning about the issues relating to climate change as they affect the group water schemes and public water supply in general. I think it's a very relevant topic for you. You're facing into big investment decisions, you're facing into uncertainty as regards water supply and competition for water in the future. So it's very timely that you're devoting this particular event to the issue of climate change and water. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully get going. So if I can just get going on this one. Yes, so obviously water is the blue gold of the next century, perhaps. And I wanted to begin by just emphasizing the importance for you of the most recent Intergovernmental Panel report on climate change, which received a lot of publicity, and I think rightly so. This is the gold standard. This is the report which will be cited for the next 7 to 8 years, because that's the interval between these key reports coming out, which are a reflection of a partnership between academia and government. And the Irish government, for example, has signed off acceptance of this report, having gone through the summary for policymakers line by line. It's, as you can see, a very comprehensive effort, several hundred authors, but most importantly, several thousand review comments received, and each one tabulated, each one considered, and each one responded to. And a synthesis of where we are in the science of climate change thus has emerged. 14,000 scientific papers, for example, reviewed as part of that process. So what have they found? Well, they found, first of all, that, of course, as we now know, we're in a period of unprecedented warming. The past nearly 2 centuries at this stage have not been paralleled in the past 2,000 years in terms of the rate and speed of warming that the Earth has seen. And we're living through the warmest period, the warmest multi-century period, in certainly more than 100,000 years. So we're in exceptional times. And one of the things that the report is unequivocal about is that for the first time, humans are in control of global climate. It's not the climate that we depend on, fluctuations for our harvest, fluctuations for saving hay, for example, as our forefathers did. But now we are the people controlling climate. And that's demonstrated in this graph here, for example, which shows many, many hundreds of global climate runs and the bottom, with only the natural forcing processes that our ancestors had. And you can see that, well, if that was the case, we should be cooling down now slightly. But in fact, it's only when we put in the human factors that we begin to see just how close the correspondence is between the observed temperature and the changes we've made to the atmosphere in terms of greenhouse gas loading. So those are kind of convincing evidence that really put the skeptics completely off the wall at this stage. What we see also is that we hear a lot of talk about 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of global warming, but we know that this is something which is an average, and that over the land masses, especially over the interiors of the continents and in the high Arctic and Antarctic, we know that the warming is greater than it is, for example, over the oceans. So for those places, there will be even more problems with warming. And in some parts of the world, it will become very difficult to sustain outdoor activity in the very hot parts of the world as we warm by 3, 4, 5 degrees. And for example, as we get in the Middle East, maximum average daily temperatures of over 50 degrees centigrade. We know also that there will be implications for water supply in terms of the rainfall changes. And you can see in the bottom right here, the way in which, for example, the tongue of warmth here extending, especially into the Mediterranean basin, is of some concern, really, for that part of the world in particular. For people trying to manage their activities, we know that the extremes will be the harbingers of climate change. We know, for example, that the kind of events which maybe were occurring once every 10 years in the past are now likely to be occurring once every 2 or 3 years as a result of the warming. And that will apply to the extreme events as well. The ones which really causes most problems, they will also become much more frequent as temperature warms up. And that will also apply to water. And that's, of course, concern to people managing water supplies, where, for example, the heavy rainfall events, which are not great for feeding your water in your aquifers, because a lot of it runs off, those kinds of events, but it does cause problems, of course, of surface water flooding. Those kind of problems we're going to see a lot more frequently as well. And equally drought, which is a concern, and we've become very conscious of drought recently in Ireland. We didn't think it was a problem, but now we're going to see it occur, I think, more frequently than we did in the past, especially during summertime. But there are parts of the world that will suffer more than most. The low-lying, small island developing states, where many hundreds of thousands of people live within a few meters of sea level, the marginal zones of sub-Saharan Africa, the great deltas of the world, where, of course, sea level will cause inundation and maybe lose many of their homes. You can see from Bangladesh here how much of that country lies within 3, 4, 5 meters of sea level. There's 160 million people in that country. Where will they go? What will we see in terms of climate refugees? So the world has been warming. It's been warming consistently. We know last year was the warmest year on record in Europe. We know that last year was also tied with 2016 as the warmest ever year on the planet. And even July of this year was the warmest month ever recorded on Earth. So the evidence is fairly incontrovertible. And what's of concern, of course, is that as we warm, we begin to approach tipping points where we don't know what will happen to key parts of our environment. We know that the coral reefs will probably be gone if we warm more than 2 degrees. We know that the alpine glaciers may well have started the irrevocable meltout, as the Arctic summer sea ice seems to have. We know that even Greenland, which will take a long time to melt out, may well be past the point of no return. These are issues which may have influence on other aspects of our climate that I'll come to in a second. And of course, lurking down the road, if we continue on our present track, there are even more dangerous tipping points to be experienced as well. But we've seen this year in particular the way in which some of those extremes are coming home to roost in terms of the fires that we've seen across the world, the destruction of the tropical rainforest, and our failure really to make good on some of the progress we made in countries like Brazil, which is now unraveling under the present governmental policies being applied there. So those are things which are, really demonstrating to us that we're underway with some of the more serious aspects and perhaps approaching some of those tipping points as well. This is an interesting satellite from a couple of days ago, a satellite image of the northern Arctic regions, and you can see the summer sea ice has now dwindled close to its minimum point this year, but you can sail from Ireland all the way around to China or Japan without encountering ice in the northern parts of our globe. You can also sail with a bit of ingenuity maybe, but you can make the fabled Northwest Passage through to Alaska, California, and the west coast of North America. It looked for a long time this year as if we were going to hit record levels, but in fact the ice has stabilized a little. We're still down on the average, but perhaps not going to be one of the worst years in the recent past. Now, why is that important? Well, increasingly there is evidence that what we do in the Arctic to the summer sea ice may affect the jet streams that cross Ireland and Europe, may give us more in the way of fluctuations in the jet stream. And we've seen some of those impacts, for example, in terms of winters which have been particularly warm in North America and particularly cold over us in Europe. And you can imagine the jet stream occupying this really big loop giving warmth over North America and cold as it plunges cold air south over Europe. And the opposite happened in February 2019. Very, very cold winter in North America, very mild winter in Europe. So there are linkages coming out which are of concern to us, and those extremes are perhaps really quite alarming. One of the great advances of the past few years has been our ability to attribute the extremes to human causes. And this is one of the more dramatic ones from Siberia in 2020, where the most northerly occupied, permanently occupied settlement on the planet, way up here, not far from the pole, experienced summer temperatures of plus 38 degrees centigrade. Normally in February, the temperature goes down to minus 50. We get a short summer there, like an Irish summer, but we don't get anything like 38 degrees. And that's really perhaps telling us something about what's been going on. And more recently, that same kind of a methodology of approach, of attribution, has been used to tell us that the German floods, the Belgian floods that were so well publicized, so dramatic and catastrophic this summer, well, they were 9 times more likely as a consequence of what we've done to the atmosphere. Ireland is no exception to all of this, of course. We're seeing as well Ireland following the global trend. We're seeing from our modelling that we've done in Maynooth, for example, a further warming of 1 degree likely in the next 20 to 40 years. We're seeing, and this is perhaps most relevant to you, changes in rainfall are likely with wetter winters, especially in the west of Ireland, and drier summers, especially in the east. Now that itself is a real red flag. It means that we have more flooding problems likely in winter. It means that we have more water shortage problems likely in summer. And that's going to be of significance for our environment, for our bogs, for our salt marshes, for our machair and montane areas. It's going to be significant for many of the species in Ireland which are attuned to past climate, not to future climate. It's going to be something that's going to be of importance for you in water resource management. Of course, floods have problems for you. They have problems in terms of bringing contamination into the water courses that you handle. Some of that may be urban related, not very welcome contamination. Some of those floods, of course, may be caused by our own stupidity in terms of pandering to, if you like, very powerful development interests where we shouldn't be doing that. But we know that we're going to pay a cost for all of this. This is just a recent estimate of what coastal flooding will cost in the next few decades. And you're looking at 2 billion simply from sea level rise, not from storm surges, not from inland flooding. So these are big money that we're passing on as costs to the next generation. Now for yourselves, well, there are 2 threats, I think. One is to the surface water quality and quantity we've mentioned. The other is to the groundwater. And in terms of the surface water quality, climate change does increase the treatment problems that you're likely to face. In particular, of course, you know that surface waters which drain peat catchments often require a lot of chlorine to be put into it. And this can cause problems in terms of trihalomethane formation. And this is a difficulty that we haven't really overcome still in Ireland. We're not really fulfilling our obligations under the Drinking Water Directive in relation to trihalomethanes. And you can see that the number of supplies with failures in this is really indicating it's the #1 problem that has to be tackled in terms of treatment of water supplies. We also are facing difficulties in terms of, I suppose, the surface abstraction of water, in that if we have less river flow in the summer, we're going to face increased pollutant concentrations. And you can see here the nitrates problem, especially in the east and southeast of Ireland, coincident with the areas of intensive dairy agriculture in particular. And you can see also that, well, in general, the problem is getting worse rather than better. So There are areas of risk. There are areas of risk which don't meet the framework directive, and that those lie especially in the east, but there are problems spreading west as intensification continues. In terms of groundwater, of course, we know that there are aquifers at risk, and those risks are complicated, for example, by floods which may overtop and result in septic tank effluent being percolated down to the groundwater level. And these are areas of concern, I think, in terms of planning in particular. You can see the density of septic tanks here. Well, it's not actually in rural Ireland that they're most dense, it's around our towns and cities, but the density around aquifers are obviously going to be of concern for planning in the future. So lots of water problems. How should you adapt? Well, I think the first thing is to use water more efficiently, to reduce your water footprint, obviously. Be more efficient in terms of how you pump water, maintain your treatment facilities as efficiently as you can. Make sure you have a bit of leeway by having maybe wells a little deeper than otherwise, so that if you have a dry season, you're not going to suffer. But plan ahead for water stress. And there's a whole panoply of practical things you can do. Have variable speed pumps, for example. So you're not using a pump that's oversized for most of your pumping needs and therefore using up energy inefficiently. Maybe you can use renewable energy for pumping. Maybe you can size your pipes, because every bend in your pipe means friction losses. And obviously switch like everybody else, negotiate with your energy supplier and try and really reduce excessive usage if at all possible. There are other ways of perhaps reducing demand through rainwater harvesting, minimizing leaks and so on, which I'm sure you're well aware of as well. We have a huge water footprint in Ireland, about 3,600 litres per day. That sounds incredible, I know, and most of it's invisible, it's embodied in the products we use, but we still have a lot of water demand if we count it all up. And that can be counted up and has been counted up for Irish people in terms of our water footprint. We hear a lot about our carbon footprint, but of course, you can see here that, you know, to produce, for example, a cup of coffee takes 140 litres of water. To produce a kilogram of beef takes 15,000 litres of water. So, you know, we can make choices as consumers to help reduce that if we can. And finally, then, there's also practical forward planning issues. This is a little study I was involved in many years ago, looking at water abstraction in County Meath, and using climate models to say, well, how will the demand for water increase with population, with increased demand, and how can we expect water stress to emerge in the future? And you can see just from the general trend of these histograms, you could expect water stress to increase, in this case in Kells, consistently over the next 30, 40 years. But with that kind of a model, you can then say, well, what if we reduce demand? How much can we stave off the need for more investment? What if we reduce leakages? How much time does that buy us? How much, therefore, can we, if you like, adapt to future water stress in a particular area? And when do we need to start putting in further plans and new infrastructure? And finally, you know, don't be disheartened. Every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. Every choice matters. This comes not from an NGO. This comes directly from the IPCC, a very conservative body who don't usually make that kind of a statement. But it's an indication to us that really we are now facing a climate and biodiversity emergency, and really that water will be in the forefront of that. So I wish you well in tackling those issues in the years ahead.